to separate the two. I can't give you all the data. What I can do is sort of take you by the hand and lead you past the evidence that has led me to the conclusions that I've reached after 35 years of study. 4 major conclusions. 1, the evidence is simply overwhelming that planet Earth is being visited by intelligently controlled extraterrestrial spacecraft. In other words, some, underline the some about 18 times, some UFOs are alien spacecraft. Most are not. I don't care about them. 2, the subject of flying saucers represents a kind of cosmic Watergate. That is to say, some few people in the governments of the United States, Canada, undoubtedly many other countries, it is a worldwide problem after all, have known since July 1947, when 2 crashed flying saucers and their crews were recovered in New Mexico, that some UFOs are extraterrestrial spacecraft. 3, none of the arguments made by a very small group, very noisy debunkers, skeptics, noisy negativists, whatever you want to call them, against the first 2 conclusions, stand up under careful consideration. Their arguments sound great until you look at the evidence, then they collapse of their own weight. And finally, 4, we're dealing with the biggest story of the millennium. Visits to planet Earth by alien spacecraft, successful cover-up of the best data, the wreckage, the bodies, etc., by the government for more than 46 years. Strong words. By the time we're finished, I think you'll see how I got to them, and perhaps you'll agree with them as well. With today's modern technology, it's not too difficult to fake any kind of photographs. You know what computers can do. You see it on television all the time. But that isn't so true for pictures of flying saucers taken 20, 30, 40 years ago, even 10 years ago. There are a lot of pictures. I'm sure there are a lot more sitting in people's drawers at home in their cabinets waiting for the breakthrough to come when the government tells all. But we can look at a selection of these. There have been motion pictures. We're getting to the point where there are a lot of video cameras because lots of camcorders are around. This first one was taken motion picture in the southwestern part of the United States near the Four Corners area. You see the very rapid pace across the middle of the picture. That's a natural monument in the background, not a man-made structure. You notice the second one coming after it. That lasts for a total of about 20 frames, roughly 1 second, not much to work on. So let's slow it down and look at these 2 going across. Now, movie cameras are not ideal scientific instruments because the exposure time is pretty long, 30th of a second or so, compared to what you'd want for a scientific experiment. But it's an interesting piece of photography. There are a lot of decent stills around which have been analyzed by professional scientists. Here's one of 2 from McMinnville, Oregon, taken by a farmer, Paul Trent, not a sophisticated individual at all. Pictures have been analyzed by Dr. Bruce Maccabee, an optical physicist with a Navy research lab, a very sophisticated individual. He's looked at the original negatives, examined them very carefully. You can see there's 2 pictures, and then we'll blow up the object, enlarge it in the second one. Notice the interesting shape and the sort of hood ornament there up at the middle. This next picture was taken near Rouen, France by a French military pilot 4 years, 6,000 miles away. Same shape, same hood ornament, obviously rented from the same great car rental agency in the sky. This next picture is one of 3 that were taken near Santa Ana, California by Rex Heflin, who worked for the state highway department. He was driving his van. He had a Polaroid camera on the seat of the car, always did, on the seat of the van. Saw this object, took pictures from inside the van, first out ahead of him. You can see that here. We can enlarge that first one, sort of a hat with the dome on it. Then 2 pictures taken outside to the right, taken from inside the van, but through the side door window. This is Santa Ana, California. 3 years later, and 7,000 miles away, includes Romania. We have another set of 3 pictures. There were 3 witnesses to this one, 2 people watching the guy take the pictures. They were analyzed in Romania, again in England, published in one of the better journals of Flying Saucer Review. Here's yet another object from Bolodic Yugoslavia that looks like the same model. Nobody's saying they all look alike, just as obviously our spacecraft don't all look alike. Here's another set of pictures, this time from Salt Lake City, Utah. There's a sequence of 7. I've seen the negatives uncut, taken by a professional photographer. There's no building there, there's nothing reflecting off glass. You can follow the object as it moves from left to right across the sky, and yes, that's the Mormon Temple in Salt Lake City. And then we'll enlarge number 5, 1 through 7 there, you see. Enlarge number 5, and I think that region around the object is an ionized air plasma related to a magneto-aerodynamic propulsion system. The next picture is from Hawaii. The object's in the upper right-hand portion. You notice the palm trees and the hula girls. And here's a blow-up of that same frame. That's Hawaii. Here's one from Yungay, Peru. 2 objects in this one in the upper left-hand portion of the picture. And here's a sequence from Trindade, I'm told it's pronounced, 600 miles east of the coast of Brazil. The ship was there as part of the International Geophysical Year and had an official Brazilian Navy photographer on board. There'd been a sighting earlier in the week in that area. It was broad daylight. Suddenly everybody shouts, "Hey, there goes a flying saucer. Take a picture," in Portuguese, of course. Grabs his camera, takes the pictures, takes 6 of them. 4 of them show the object. As the object came in from the right at high speed, makes a sharp turn and takes off again, a Saturn-shaped object like the planet Saturn. The pictures were eventually released to the public by the president of Brazil, Juscelino Kubitschek. Here's the first one. This is at some distance now. Here's number 2. Here's number 3. And here's number 4. And this is the best of the batch, so we'll blow that one up and we'll enlarge it once again. And we're kind of back where we started. At least 50 different companies on this planet that could build things that look like that. But I know of none that back in the 50s could build things that look like that and fly like that. High speed, sharp turn, no noise, no visible external engines, no wings, no tail. If it wasn't built here on Earth, it was built someplace else. And it's time we did something about it. What I'm trying to do is to make you aware of the overwhelming evidence that some UFOs are extraterrestrial spacecraft. To remind you of something you already know, that is to say, we all do have something in common on this planet. We're all Earthlings. And also to demonstrate that we're dealing with a cosmic Watergate.
We've been able to explain them as hoaxes, as erroneously identified friendly aircraft, as meteorological or electronic phenomena, or as light aberrations. However, there have been a certain percentage of this volume of reports that have been made by credible observers of relatively incredible things.
My first reaction was, Polaroid? It's got to be real. I mean, how do you fake a Polaroid? And that's what had me convinced to go ahead and put it in the paper right away.
With all due respect to the Air Force, I believe that some of them will prove to be of interplanetary origin. During a 3-year investigation, I found that many pilots have described objects of substance and high speed. One case, pilots reported their plane was buffeted by an object which passed them at 500 miles an hour. Obviously, this was a solid object, and I believe it was from outer space.
Well, you'll hear that over and over again, everywhere I go. How come most people don't believe in UFOs? You must be the only scientist that believes in UFOs. Let's look at the facts. Here are the results of 4 Gallup polls that have been taken, asking the same question. Do you think UFOs are real, imaginary, or you're not sure? Even back in the mid-60s, before we'd been to the moon, the believers outnumbered non-believers 1.5 to 1. In the late 70s, it was better than 2 to 1 believers over non-believers. Now, admittedly, sometimes the data's been sort of misrepresented because they leave out the not sure types. I remember a newspaper headline that said only 46% believe in UFOs, implying that 54% did not. The fact was Only 29% did not. The rest couldn't make up their mind one way or another. Anyway, you'll notice, in the most recent of the polls, and there was another one within the last couple of years, shows the same results. The believers still outnumber the non-believers by 1.5 to 1. Now, every politician would like odds like that at the election. Now, the skeptic might say at this point, hey, I know why that is. That's because all those supermarket tabloids have convinced people that there's something to flying saucers. Right? Wrong. That's a testable hypothesis. If it were true that it was the influence of the crazy stories in the tabloids, then presumably the greater the education, the less likely to believe in flying saucers, because I think it's fair to expect that people with more education are going to be less influenced by the tabloids. Well, if you look at the bottom of this information, the bottom part of this story, you'll see quite the reverse. Now, admittedly, for adults, and this is all adults now, it's not children, adults with only a grade school education, the non-believers slightly outnumber the believers. Getting a high school diploma makes believers over non-believers 2 to 1. And with a college background, it's almost 3 to 1. Simple conclusion, the better the education, the greater the education of the individual, the more likely to believe in flying saucers.
I've often wondered, what if all of us in the world discovered that we were threatened by a power from outer space, from another planet? Wouldn't we all of a sudden find that we didn't have any differences between us at all?
Ronald Reagan made allusions to alien forces not once, but 5 different times, including a speech before the United Nations.
And why did he say that 5 times? Once, it's a nice figure of speech, but he said it in the United Nations. He said it to Gorbachev in Geneva. Gorbachev responded, saying he didn't disagree with him. He said it at a high school in Maryland. Why bring that up unless there was some reason for bringing it up? The greater the education, the more likely to believe. That's exactly the opposite of what the skeptics have been trying to tell us for decades, but they don't have any data. If you're a believer, you're with the cream of the crop. It's time to come out of the closet. You're not at the bottom of the barrel. Let's stop being apologist ufologist and closet ufologists. Let's tell it like it is.
While in space as command pilot on Gemini 5, astronaut General James McDivitt saw an unidentified object approach his spacecraft and then move away when he tried to film it. One astronaut who actually chased a UFO while a fighter pilot in Germany in 1951 is Colonel Gordon Cooper. One of the original 7 Mercury astronauts, Colonel Cooper sent this letter to the United Nations November 9th, 1978, to express his view on UFOs. I believe that these extraterrestrial vehicles and their crews are visiting this planet from other planets, which obviously are a little more technically advanced than we are here on Earth.
Incidentally, a poll taken of engineers and scientists involved in research and development activities, twice no less, shows that 2/3 of those who expressed an opinion said they're real too. So you're in very good company.
As a presidential candidate, Jimmy Carter vowed to completely open the government's UFO files because Carter said he had seen one himself. In 1977, there were hints in national magazines that disturbing revelations were about to be made by the president. They never were. And Carter didn't open the files. We wrote to ask him why, and we're told Carter is too busy for any interviews.
In the early days, the arguments were all along the lines, first of all, what people claim to have observed is obviously impossible, so they couldn't have observed it. Now, let's understand, that's backwards science. The observations are real, whether you understand them or not is beside the point. I mean, the sun has been fusioning, that's how it produces its energy, for 5 billion years. We figured out how it worked in 1937. Does anybody want to suggest because we didn't know how it worked that it wasn't working? That's nonsense. That's not science. Now, the list of its impossibles has shrunk as we've accomplished those objectives over the last 4 decades or so, many by work that's you can see here. But there are 2 arguments that are still being made, technological arguments. The first of the it's impossible arguments is that you can't get here from there. It's usually made in a much fancier way. and typically by astronomers for reasons which I don't understand. The argument goes like this. It's a huge universe out there, billions of light years, billions of galaxies, billions of stars. Surely there's life all over the place out there. And some of that life must be more advanced than we are because they've been around a lot longer than we are. Life all over the place, but you can't get here from there. So give us a few bucks, we'll build a radio telescope and listen for signals because undoubtedly the more advanced civilizations are trying to attract our attention with radio signals. You know, hello Earth, just waiting for us to join the galactic radio network. Did you ever hear such silly nonsense in your life? Especially when you add into the picture, as one professor suggested, when we hook into the network, they will then transmit to us all the secrets of the universe. Why would an advanced civilization give its secrets to a primitive society whose major activity is tribal warfare? That's us, in case you didn't recognize the description. Would make as much sense to give 2-year-olds loaded guns to play with. Now, you can't get here from there. Right? Wrong. Now, we can go to the scientific record. There have been loads of papers published, and what a track record it is for the astronomy community. Back in 1903, a great American astronomer, Simon Newcomb, October 1903, published a paper in which he showed that the only way man would ever fly would be with the help of a lighter-than-air vehicle, a balloon. That was 2 months before the Wright brothers' first flight. When he heard about the flight, his comment was, well, maybe a pilot, but they'll certainly never carry any passengers. We know how right he was. Another great astronomer in the 20s said that, proved, mathematical equations, that it would be impossible ever to give anything sufficient energy to get it into orbit around the Earth. You don't have to look far around here to know how wrong that was.
Yeah, we're getting some really spectacular video downlink from the payload bay cameras. You guys are just passed over Hudson Bay, we believe, and I guess we're seeing a lot of cloud patterns over Hudson Bay. Just before that, we're seeing large bodies of water.
My favorite, though, is a Canadian astronomer, Dr. Campbell. In 1941, he was sick and tired of all this science fiction stuff about going to the moon. So he did a scientific paper in which he tried to calculate the required initial launch weight of a rocket, just a chemical rocket, which is what all these are, able to get a man to the moon and back. That's a legitimate question. How big would it have to be? Pages of equations. Bottom line, the required initial launch weight of a chemical rocket able to get a man to the moon and back would be 1 million tons. Now, even for me, that's too big. But isn't it interesting that less than 30 years later, we got 3 guys to the moon and back, still with the chemical rocket, whose initial launch weight, one of the members of the Saturn family, like this one back here, the initial launch weight wasn't 1 million tons, it was 3,000 tons. He was off by a factor of 300 million. How could he be so far off? Because he made all the wrong assumptions. How could such a respected academic professor be so far off in his calculations? He wasn't the first, and he certainly won't be the last. His problem was that he made all the wrong assumptions because he didn't know anything about space travel. That's what aeronautical engineers are for. For example, he assumed a single-stage rocket. None of our manned space launches have been done with single-stage rockets. 2, 3 stages, more like it. Saves a lot on weight. He assumed a limit of 1g acceleration for the rocket. Now, certainly we can all stand 1g, but the astronauts who get on these 4th, 1947, just 2 weeks earlier than these headlines. Kenneth Arnold, a private pilot, in broad daylight was searching for a downed aircraft in the mountains of Washington State, and he spotted 9 objects that moved, as he later described it, as a saucer would if you skipped it across the water. He reported it when he landed. The press picked up on it. He didn't say they looked like flying saucers, but the press coined the term flying saucer. UFO wasn't used until after 1950. Within the next 2 weeks, there were sightings in 40-some states and several other countries. And it was headline material.
Army fighter planes are on patrol for flying saucers. Cameras installed to photograph them. Portland, Oregon, the area from which came the first weird reports. This flying saucer patrol shows how the Air Forces, while not putting too much stock in the mysterious things in the sky, are investigating. The control towers
this
in touch
happened
and on the watch.
apparently about July the 2nd or 3rd. A rancher named Mac Brazel, on a ranch out in the boondocks, 75 miles or so northwest of Roswell, 15 miles southeast of the little town of Corona, heard a tremendous explosion late one night. It was during the middle of an electrical storm. He didn't think it was thunder, though. The next morning, he's out checking on a water pump. This is a sheep ranch out in the boonies. It's pretty dry, and water's very important. And he comes across an area 3/4 of a mile long, a few hundred feet wide, strewn with pieces of strange wreckage. It was weird. There were pieces of a foil-like material, about the thickness of a foil on a pack of cigarettes. But you couldn't tear it, couldn't break through it. Later on, with a 16-pound sledgehammer, you couldn't break through it. Extraordinarily strong and extraordinarily light. There were some I-beam-shaped pieces, nothing bigger than about this long, about a half-inch high, about the weight of balsa wood, next to nothing. But you couldn't cut them, break them, burn them, and there were strange pastel symbols along the inside.
According to my dad, there was a bad thunderstorm the night before. The next day, he was out on the ranch, and he found this debris. And he picked it all up in his pickup and was talking to people, and of course, there was some talk about UFOs. He was going to Roswell, and as far as I know, he got in touch with the sheriff's department. They, in turn, called the Air Force.
Brazel, a rancher, the ranch had no electricity. He hadn't heard all these stories about flying saucers. There was a neighbor's young son visiting there because he liked to ride horseback with Mac. When Mac took him back to his home, the Porter family, he asked the neighbors to come out and see this stuff. He took some pieces with him. They handled it. They remember it. A Proctor family, Loretta Proctor.
The piece he brought us looked like a kind of a tan, light brown plastic is what it looked like. Of course, we know plastic now. Back then we didn't have any plastic.
Finally, on July 6th, a Sunday, Mac decides to put some of the pieces of this junk in the back of his pickup truck and go into Roswell. He goes to the Sheriff Wilcox's office, tells the sheriff he's got this stuff. The sheriff looks at it, calls the base, the local Roswell Army airfield.
I asked him, do you think this is true? And he said, I don't know why Brazel would have come all the way in here and brought that stuff if it hadn't been something important, and that he didn't, that it had to be something that he thought was that.
It was a very special base. It was the home of the 509th Composite Bomb Group. That's the group that dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and out in the Pacific in 1946. Hand-picked officers, hand-picked men, high security, a very elite special group. Flying B-29s, the Cold War was already heating up at that time. The sheriff, by prearrangement, called the base, talks to the base intelligence officer, Major Jesse Marcel. There was a pre-existing arrangement to do that. Jesse checks with his boss, and Colonel Blanchard, base commander, head of the 509th, goes into town, looks at the stuff, realizes it is indeed very strange, gets instructions to go with the counterintelligence corps man. Remember, this is highly classified base, lots of highly classified activity in New Mexico. Take the counterintelligence corps man, Sheridan Cavett, with you, see what's going on out there.
The material that we saw, just like it whatever it caused it was just like whatever there, it was just vaporized.
Now, there was no way you could tell Jesse and Cavett how to get there. It was out in the boonies. They had to follow the rancher out there. Took their sleeping bags, stayed overnight, had a can of beans, as Jesse told me. The next morning, the rancher shows them this area, and Jesse's mystified.
One thing I was certain of, being familiar with all our activities, that it was not a weather balloon, nor an aircraft, nor a missile. It was something else of which we didn't know what it was. They were just fragments strewn all over the area, an area about 3/4 of a mile long and several hundred feet wide.
If there's all this wreckage, there had to be some kind of an explosion. He can't find a crater, so it must have happened in midair. They load 2 vehicles, an Army carryall and a Buick, with as much of this stuff as they can fit in. And there was lots of it left behind. And they head back toward town. It's late now. Jesse stops at home, wakes his wife and 11-year-old son, brings in some of the pieces of stuff to the kitchen table. They try to fit the pieces together to get some idea of how big this thing must have been.
There was black plastic type debris like bakelite, which was shattered. It was very brittle material. And then there were fragments of what appeared to be I-beams.
And the son is important because he's now a medical doctor, Jesse Marcel Jr. He's a pilot, he's a flight surgeon, he served on military aircraft accident investigative teams, was himself shot down in Southeast Asia. He knows wreckage. He has never seen anything like it, including those strange symbols.
Well, the most unusual part of this whole thing was what was on the I-beam, on the inner surface of the I-beam. Because as you look at it head on, there appeared to be a type of writing.
Well, Jesse goes into the base the next morning, and Colonel Blanchard gives 2 orders. One is to Jesse, get one of the B-29 crews to take you and this stuff up to Wright Field in Ohio. It's now Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. All the base names changed when the Air Force became a separate body in September of '47, after this took place. Make a stop at our headquarters. The 509th was part of the 8th Air Force, which was part of the Strategic Air Command, then headquartered in Washington, in the Washington, D.C. These are cases where the saucer is seen on or near the ground, and after it leaves, one finds physical changes, the equivalent of burn circles, burn rings, Landiger marks, swirled vegetation. I don't mean these crop circles, that's a whole other business. Directly associated with the presence of a real craft. And frankly, after you read your first 200 cases, it's dull. The same thing keeps happening all over the world. In 24% of those cases, over 1,000, reports are made of creatures associated with the craft. There's a humanoid study group with the Mutual UFO Network, the world's largest respectable UFO group. And they've collected more than 3,000 reports of humanoids. Abduction researchers, and I know a number of professionals who cumulatively have examined well over 1,000 abduction cases. Some of them involving several people at the same time, some of them involving the same people abducted repeatedly over a period of many years. Now, here's a typical physical trace case. This is on the Johnson farm in Delphos, Kansas. Ronnie Johnson, age 16, finishing his chores for the evening, getting ready to go in for dinner, looks up, and here's this glowing mushroom-shaped object sitting a foot or 2 off the ground, brilliantly lit. Not light bulbs, but just glowing. So bright he could barely see. You know how you get blinded by bright lights? He's standing there, kind of petrified, and frankly, he was paralyzed. He couldn't move, neither could his dog, so it wasn't psychological. He's standing there, and this thing suddenly takes off. It just clears the shed, whose shadow you can see in the picture, and it moves off slowly in the sky. He dashes into the house, 250 feet. I've been on the farm. Tries to tell his parents about this flying saucer that he'd just seen. Naturally, they laughed. They didn't believe him. Naturally, he got angry. You don't have to believe him. You go out and see it for yourself. And they did go out, and they did see it. Then, with a little more effort, he convinced them to go back to the place on their farm where this saucer had been sitting on or near the ground. They get out there, and they see this glowing ring of soil. Bottom of the tree was glowing, a board was glowing. This is really weird. Mother reaches down, touches the glowing ring of soil, picks up her hand, her fingers go numb. Can't take pulses at the rest of them where she works as a nurse for the next couple of weeks. They're kind of concerned about this. They take pictures, they call the sheriff's office. The sheriff comes out the next day, takes soil samples. They're worrying about radioactivity. The soil wasn't radioactive. A reporter for the local paper, the Delphos Republican, picks up on the story because it's on the sheriff's file. This article appears in the story, in the paper, and a month later, Ted Phillips, this guy in Missouri who collects all these physical trace cases, gets sent a copy of the article. He checks with the sheriff. Yeah, I know the Johnson family for years. They're fine people. Ted decides to go out there. It'd been a month. There'd been rain. There'd been snow that had melted, but might be worth looking at. He gets out there. Everything is mud except for the dry ring of soil. Mud on the inside, mud on the outside, but the ring is dry. Pours water on the ring, runs right off. Doesn't get absorbed at all. Took a whole bunch of samples, both in the ring soil, the ring's roughly 10 feet in diameter, and in the inside and outside the ring, in the control samples. He ran tests. First he ran a seed germination test. The ring soil wouldn't grow anything. The normal soil, the seeds germinated fine. He ran a moisture absorption test. You can see that here. That's water sitting on the dirt. It's not plastic, it's not glue, it's water. The stuff won't absorb moisture. Ted sent me samples of the soil, which you can see here, and I had good agricultural tests done by a professional testing laboratory. They found that the ring soil on the left had a higher level of soluble minerals. These are the things that affect plant growth than the normal soil on the right. They're obviously different in color and texture. That doesn't mean the aliens dumped their garbage here. It probably means that normal soil like that on the right was intensely irradiated with something like microwaves, like cooking a turkey in a microwave oven. It'll penetrate through 14 inches of soil. That's how far down it was dry in this ring. Convert some of the insolubles to solubles. It's a whole new direction for ufological research. A NASA manager has said that they would test any lab specimens that were required for testing about UFOs. He still hasn't agreed to test any soil samples. We're working on it. We're here at the Astronaut Hall of Fame, and behind me you can see a mock-up of the shuttle. That's the leading edge of today's manned spaceflight technology. It's unclassified. But many people seem not to be aware of how much technology has been developed under security. I spent 14 years of my life working on classified advanced research and development programs. They touch every aspect of advanced technology. And not only are there classified programs whose existence is known but whose details are classified, but they're also what are known as black programs, black budget items. These are items that are funded somehow without congressional oversight. How big are these programs? A Pulitzer Prize-winning author named Tim Weiner has written an exciting, extremely well-documented book, Blank Check, the Pentagon's Black Budget. He makes a convincing case that the annual black budget, not under congressional control, has been running about $35 billion. About half for technology, stealth fighters, stealth aircraft, and Lord knows what else, and about half for intelligence. And certainly the intelligence community is involved with flying saucers. That's been true from the beginning. Let me give you some demonstrations of that. A group of us called Citizens Against UFO Secrecy, back in the late 70s, went after the CIA, everybody's favorite target, of course. We want all your UFO information. They said, we don't have any UFO information. You do too. We do not. We appeal. They deny. We go to court. There's a procedure under Freedom of Information. The judge asked that they do a search. They did a very limited search. They suddenly found 900 pages of material. Not terribly exciting, none of it above secret. I've been to 15 different government archives. Loads of top secret stuff has been declassified. Lots hasn't as well. Anyway, more important than the 900 pages of information was a list of 57 documents which they found dealing with UFOs, but that came from other agencies, and so they couldn't release them. Everybody and his brother was collecting data about flying saucers. The CIA, of course, was, but the OSI, the DIA, the ONI, FBI, Department of State. Most interesting were 18 documents from the National Security Agency. Now, they only give dates. We don't know what